get started. It is 11:01 and I said we kick off at 11, so we better get going. Massive welcome to everyone and thanks so much for joining us here today. We hope that, my name's Annie Haslam. I'm part of the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar Committee, and we'll have the rest of the committee working behind the scenes today. We hope that you, your friends and your loved ones are travelling okay during these challenging times. We've again moved online to deliver to the seminar, where this year we'll be focusing on one of the most important factors in the preservation and restoration of biodiversity in our region, our farmers. As one of the principal custodians of much of the land across the region, farmers and the work they do to maintain their land and environment playing an increasingly important role. We hope you enjoy the offerings we have arranged for you throughout September. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of all the land wherever we join this seminar from today. For me, participating from Horsham, Victoria, this is the land of the Wotjobaluk, Jadwa, Jadwajali, Wergai and Japajok peoples. I'd like to extend my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders who may be joining us today. We recognise their proud traditions, vibrant culture and continued connection to land, water and the community. As I said, there's a great band of people working behind the scenes to bring you this seminar. I'd like to acknowledge all the hard work that they've put in this year and thank the committee and the organisations that have supported the delivery of this year's event. This year we're grateful to Bank Australia, Barangaroo Gadgin Land Council, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Trust for Nature, GWM Water and the Wimmera CMA. Just a few housekeeping messages before we jump into some presentations. Can all participants please make sure that they are on mute and have their videos turned off? This will just make everything run a lot smoother. It's great to see people's faces, but sometimes the internet doesn't quite hold up, so if you can please do that. If you're using the Teams link to watch the presentation, you can ask questions of our presenters using the chat box at any time. We'll curate the questions and ask the popular ones of each presenter at the end of their presentation. So I'll just ask the presenters. So you can give a thumbs up to questions you'd like to let us know which questions to ask. If you're viewing today's presentation via YouTube and you have a question, we'd love to hear them as well. You'll just have to email us at wimmerabiodiversityseminar@hotmail.com and we'll be able to ask the presenters those questions as well. Please note that this Teams meeting is being recorded, so we ask that participants do not record the presentation. If you'd like to view this session again at a later date or tell other people about it, recordings will be available on the Swift website after the event. If anyone is experiencing any technical issues with Teams or YouTube, please contact us on social media messaging or email wimmerabiodiversityseminar@hotmail.com if you can. And if you have access to the chat function, you can let us know in there as well. One last thing, we have mugs again this year. We've been able to order a few more than we did last year. So the first 175 people who have registered will receive a mug handmade by the very talented Wendy McInnes. And they look absolutely beautiful. She's done a fantastic job this year. We'll hold on to these until we know how we can get them to you as easily and quickly as possible. And we will let those who will be receiving a mug know by email after the last seminar. Finally, we will provide a link to a short online survey at the end of each session. So if you can please complete this, it helps us plan for future events and it should only take a minute or two to complete. Now, I'd like to pass over to Laverne to introduce our ambassador and a very special guest.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this year's 24th Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar, and we're all very excited to be actually able to present these things. It's been the last couple of years having events has been really difficult, and the fact that we can still do this at least online, if not in person, is I guess a tribute to our wonderful committee, of which I've been a member for a number of years now. You'll get to meet some of them as they'll be hosting over the next few weeks. But on to I guess the first part of this year's seminar to, I guess, launch it for us. So last year when we did have to go online, we decided we'd do something a little different, and that was invite a very special person to be our first ambassador. I've known Costa for about 7 years now. I think we've been doing different events together for in this part of the world for a while now, and he's someone who, to be quite honest, doesn't really need an introduction. Most of you will know who he is. He's obviously the very popular host of Gardening Australia, and does an absolute power of work across so many communities around Australia, and getting out there and spreading his joy and enthusiasm for all things outdoors, gardening, nature, biodiversity, you name it. So I won't take up any more time. I'm going to hand over to Costa now and let him say a few words. And thank you all for being here today.
Well, I think, am I all good? Laverne, thank you for the kind words, and a big thank you to the committee for giving me the opportunity to be an ambassador for such a wonderful project, which has been going for so long. I'd like to start by acknowledging that, of course, I'm not down there in the Wimmera. I'm not even in Victoria. They won't let me into your state. From up here, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in Bondi, which is on Gadigal and Bidigal land of the Eora. And I acknowledge the elders past, present, emerging, and the wonderful opportunities that are taking place around caring for country on so many different levels. And the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar is a standout in my books. When Laverne first contacted me and told me about the event, it was just a no-brainer. I thought, wow, this is a local event that is bringing together specialists and citizen scientists and local farmers, local growers, local people, as well as throwing the blanket wider and looking at the region and the state and nationally, and bringing together people to look at biodiversity and the fact that biodiversity involves and includes everybody. We are all part of this, and it was light bulb. I thought, yes, I want to come out there. And I remember when I mentioned it to some people, they go, well, most people didn't even know anything much about the Wimmera outside of Victoria. So it sort of reflected to me that opportunity that we all have to sow seeds of information. We're farming not just the land, and in terms of this year's theme being around farming, it's not just about farming the land, it's about farming ideas, and it's about growing community and seeding a community of people that bring these ideas into the light. And then it's our opportunity to get that light and amplify it and focus it and beam it as far and wide as we can. And when I talk about far and wide, that can be as far and wide as our family, and then it can go out further and further from there. And I think in these polarised times, it's a real credit to everyone in the committee for staying strong and keeping this event going online. And while some people, like all of us, can feel a little bit jaded by all of the online activity that we're having to partake in at the moment, this means that we can still amplify these messages. We can still take them. The thing with the festival is that it isn't about the latest trends and nuances and tricks, and it's about building, and has built over what will be next year, the 25th year, a quarter of a century of building a community that recognises the importance of biodiversity and projects and amplifies that on a daily basis. And as was mentioned earlier, the topic this year being farmers, particularly in your region, but farming as a whole around the nation and around the world, it's never been more important to value the role and also the importance of farmers as carers for country. They have large swathes of land and also small plots of land that they need and do look after, and our capacity to share information that helps that process even more is what is the most important and exciting aspect of the festival. Looking at some of the speakers, Danny Pettingill will be speaking about designing resilient and adaptive community-based restoration projects. And this is one of the key things. It's not about doing a project that may be the best thing we could possibly do, but parallel with that best thing for the environment is the best thing for the community, and making sure that we bring the community with us. Because when we bring the community with us, then it's self-maintaining because we carry the baton and we share it over. So that's going to be a fantastic element of that talk that we can think about when we may be excited about something, but we need to make sure that we temper our conversations to be appropriate to the people we're talking to allow it to gain passage and faster application and growth. Jim Radford is talking about natural accounting and biodiversity. And I think the interesting thing, and the reason I wanted to mention this, was Jim was at the seminar way back in 1988 doing his PhD. So what a wonderful thing that Jim's knowledge, his experience, his time in the biodiversity seminar is still growing and sharing. Of course, Tammy Jonas, who I know well, an agroecologist, focusing on the ethical and ecologically sound and social aspect of food systems. And that's part of farming, whatever aspect that may be. But the ethical side of it is something that's at the very core of the seminar. Angie Haslam is talking, following revegetation on farms to see how the recovery of birds go. It's this follow-up that matters, and getting more and more science into the projects so that it pushes them over the line a lot easier. And then take that to Dr. Aaliyah Pearl's talk about the volcanic plains biosphere. So we can look close up and look at one particular site, and then here we have a story about a biosphere project where we're looking at the big picture. And then when I had a brief look at the speakers from last year, Matilda Venn, the love of orchids and the perspective of a high school student, we need to bring that next generation in. We need this to be multi-generational. We want the energy and vigour of youth and that wide-eyed excitement. And what better way to do that than through orchids and that capacity to look at the world through really focused goggles. Of course, David Yates spoke about the impact of bushfires on insects, and Dennis Crawford, why the decline of insects matters. All of these things, they haven't lost any relevance. They've gained more relevance and importance in the last 12 months than ever before. Hannah Auld from Parks Victoria talking about the Bush Kinder program. Where do we grow the next generation of Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar participants? Right there with Bush Kinder. And then we went into fat-tailed dunnarts with Emily, and the DNA platypus project with Josh Griffiths, and fun times with Alison Pulo and fungi. All of these things. It's just wonderful to look back, to keep in touch with these speakers and keep their information and knowledge growing as the seminar grows for yet another year. So on that note, I don't want to go any longer other than to say thank you to all of you for participating. Make sure you share this in whatever ways you can, be it social media, be it conversations with the family, be it your regular emails and updates with friends, family, and work. Share the stories that the speakers are bringing to us. One that I just wanted to quietly share was I came across a wonderful full story. It's called hollowhog.com, Matt Stevens, and he's been working for a few years on a tool that drills a hole into existing trees and creates habitat hollows. And these are the things that we all have this capacity to amplify and share these new ideas that our speakers will be bringing to us over the next 4 weeks. So big congratulations to the committee for keeping this going. Heartfelt thanks to all of the speakers coming up over the next month, and a big call out to all of you at home, at work, wherever you are online. Share the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar as far and wide as you can, because the more the word gets out there, the more it supports all of the speakers, all of the research, all of the knowledge and the truths, so that these conversations cut through. Have a wonderful day today, and I'll hand it back.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Costa. What a way to start the seminar. It's, yeah, amazing. Love all your infectiousness. It's got us all excited, I'm sure. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Alrighty. We shall jump into our first presenter, Dr. Angie Haslam. She is a research fellow in the Department of Ecology, Environment and Evolution at La Trobe University. Her research interests span two broad fields, linked by a common theme of understanding how human land uses and management practices affect native species and ecosystems. Angie is interested in how factors such as landscape patterns, land use types, and disturbance events such as drought affect species in modified landscapes. She's also interested in how fire regimes affect patterns of temporal change in native systems, and how such understanding can be best used to guide fire management for conservation objectives. Today, Angie will be speaking about the value of revegetation on farms for birds and their recovery based on the results of a long-term study in the Glenelg Hopkins CMA. Thanks, Angie, and over to you. And yep, your presentation looks great.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks for the introduction, and to yourself and all of the organising committee for the opportunity to present some work as part of your seminar series. So as you can see, I'm presenting today on behalf of quite a large group of people. I'm going to be talking about some results of some research projects that we've undertaken looking at the value of revegetation on farms for birds, and a particular focus has been how this value changes over time. So I'd just like to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners, both of the country on which I'm presenting from today, the Wurundjeri people, but also of the land on which this research was undertaken. So that's the Gunditjmara and Eastern Maar people. Land clearing for agriculture around the world has resulted in a raft of environmental issues that we're all way too familiar with. So things like land degradation, loss of ecosystem function, and widespread declines in native species. To address these issues, there's lots of focus on returning vegetation back to cleared landscapes. So we're currently in the decade of ecosystem restoration, as identified by United Nations. And closer to home, Victoria's biodiversity strategy includes a target of returning 200,000 hectares of revegetated land back to the state before 2037. So this means that there's a range of stakeholders, diverse range of stakeholders that are involved in this process of revegetation. So it's an important topic. Revegetation in farm landscapes, as you'll all be aware, is undertaken for a range of reasons. Revegetation plots can benefit production objectives, they can help reverse environmental degradation, and they also have aesthetic value. Plantings, irrespective of what objective have been undertaken for, though, can all contribute to conservation efforts by providing habitat for fauna in largely cleared landscapes. Now, revegetation provides this habitat for native species at a range of scales. So at the local level, individual plantings provide habitat resources that are used by animals for shelter and foraging. We don't know as much about the value of revegetation at larger scales, but we do know that vegetation across broader whole landscape areas can have a positive influence on the occurrence of species, and conservation planning often also takes a broader or regional perspective. So this really represents a gap in our understanding of the value of revegetation for animals. Irrespective of what level we're talking about though, whether it's the patch or the whole landscape level, an important feature of revegetation plantings is that they change over time. So as trees and shrubs grow from tube stock through to mature vegetation, the habitat that they provide for fauna changes, and this means that their value changes also over time. Now in this study, we've addressed a couple of questions around these broad themes that I've introduced. So firstly, we tested whether revegetation can reverse the loss of species that has been associated with vegetation clearing in agricultural landscapes. So here we wanted to know whether revegetation actually returns species to landscapes, or possibly it provides more resources for the fewer numbers of species that have been able to persist over time. And at the local level, we wanted to know which attributes of plantings improve their conservation value for native species. So here we were comparing the relative influence of local decisions when it comes to planting managements with the range of factors that might be outside of management control. At both scales, we looked at how this value of revegetation changes over time. So to answer these questions, we've extended a study that we undertook in 2006-2007 in the Glenelg-Copkin CMA. So the design of our original project focused on sampling within whole landscapes. So you can see from the map here that we had quite a number. There were 43 landscapes distributed around Hamilton, and each of these landscapes was 800 hectares in size. So our sampling is undertaken at the level of this whole landscape. Now, because we were interested in determining whether revegetation can return species that have been associated with the loss of vegetation from farming landscapes, our landscapes were selected to represent gradients in the cover of different types of vegetation. So we had 11 landscapes that comprised decreasing amounts of remnant native vegetation, ranging at the high end, and I've got a diagram here to represent what I mean. This is an 800 hectare area that contains 18% cover of native vegetation, down at the low end to heavily cleared landscapes with only 1% of cover. And collectively, these 11 landscapes represent a gradient of vegetation loss. We had 21 different landscapes that were comprised of revegetation plantings and increasing amounts of across this same gradient from 1 to 18% cover. And collectively, these landscapes represent a gradient of vegetation restoration. There were 11 additional landscapes that included both remnant vegetation and revegetation plantings, but I'm not going to discuss them today. So within each of these 800 hectare landscapes, we established 12 study sites that were each 1 hectare in size. Now, they were distributed amongst 5 common habitat types to our study region and agricultural landscapes more broadly across southeastern Australia. Native vegetation, revegetation, scattered paddock trees, areas of open pasture and wetland were the habitats we sampled. And at each site we did 4 bird surveys and 1 habitat assessment. So this was the design in 2007. And then in 2019, we've gone back to 23 of these landscapes and we've resurveyed for birds and for habitat. Now, we followed exactly the same field protocols and we visited exactly the same sites per landscape, which has given us 2 data sets, one from 2007 and one from 2019 that we're going to use to track change in the value of revegetation plantings for birds over time at both of these scales, the landscape and the local level. So before I get into some results, just a very quick summary of the bird data that we collected across both survey periods. So we recorded 164 native bird species, and 60 of these were species that we consider to be woodland dependent. So they're species that are entirely dependent on native vegetation for their habitat and breeding requirements. And they're the species that I'm going to focus on in today's talk because they're the ones that we're primarily hoping will be returned to farm landscapes with revegetation. Now, 90% of these species were recorded at one point in time in revegetation, and broadly speaking, revegetation served to increase their occurrence by over 400% in relation to areas of open paddock crop. The species that we never recorded in revegetation weren't very many of them. There were 6 of them that you can see here, and they were pretty rare in general in the study area, so even within native vegetation we didn't record them often. Another species that was rare in our study region is the noisy miner. Now, this is not a woodland species, but it does have a very strong negative effect on woodland bird communities in fragmented systems. So in other areas, you'd expect to see that the noisy miner might affect the value of revegetation for woodland birds, but that's not going to be the case for our results. Okay, so starting with some results relating to our landscape level analyses. Here we're talking about our whole 800 hectare areas. And we had 43 of them, remember? And what we've done is pooled the data across the 12 survey sites and 4 bird surveys over time to give a measure of birds within that 800 hectare area. Now, first off, what I'm doing is comparing the richness of woodland bird species here between our 2 broadly different types of landscapes, our remnant landscapes in dark green and our revegetation landscapes. Now, these are results from 2007, and you can see here that there are significantly fewer woodland bird species in our revegetation landscapes. Now, adding data from 2019, you can see that after an additional 12 years of growth of revegetation, we're seeing that there are now more bird species in revegetation landscapes. They've increased by 30%, and there's now no difference in the richness of bird species between our 2 landscape types. Revegetation landscapes had increased, but remnant had shown no change. So this is a pretty positive result, and it does match our predictions from the outset. So before we collected data, we thought about what we were expecting to see, and we thought that the revegetation landscapes would show greatest change because, remember, the habitats they comprise themselves, the revegetation plantings, are showing greater change over time as they mature and develop, whereas that's not the case for remnant landscapes which contain mature vegetation. The main question that we were interested in at this landscape level, though, was whether adding increased amounts of revegetation to landscape serves to return species. So that's what this graph here is showing. On the x-axis, we've got cover of vegetation in the landscape, remember, going from our 20% cover down to 1% in relation to the number of woodland bird species in landscapes. So first of all, if you have a look at the brown line at the top of the graph, this shows the relationship for our remnant landscapes. So here they're representing the gradient of vegetation loss, and you can see that we're seeing fewer species as landscapes are progressively cleared. The green line reflects this relationship for our revegetation landscapes. And because we're seeing a positive relationship, this shows us that as revegetation plantings are added back to landscapes, it's serving to increase the number of woodland bird species, which is really exciting. But the final thing to notice here is this gap between the 2 lines. What this is showing is that our revegetation is not returning as many species have been lost when vegetation was cleared. So fast forwarding to 2019 now, this is the relationship we see here, which is super exciting. You can see that these 2 lines are pretty much exactly the same. So these are the results of our models. And what they're showing is that while the relationship for remnant landscapes has remained the same, we're now returning more species back to our revegetation landscapes as the cover of revegetation increases. So they are returning species back to landscapes, our plantings, and the same number as have been lost. If you look for an equivalent cover of vegetation, the same number of species are being returned, which is really exciting news. Doesn't quite tell the full picture though, because while these 2 different landscape types, remnant and reveg, contain the same number of woodland bird species, the composition of their communities did differ. So what this is an ordination plot, and how to interpret it is each dot that I've got here represents a different study landscape. Dots that are closer together have communities that are comprised of more similar species, whereas those further apart differ in terms of the bird communities they contain. Again, I've coloured my re-veg landscapes in light green and remnant in dark green, and you can see by the distinct clustering and separation of dots associated with our different landscape types that the bird communities in these different landscapes does show broad differences. This is for 2007, and I've now added data for 2019. So really what you can see is different types of landscapes. Our remnant landscapes and our revegetation landscapes are supporting broadly different types of woodland birds, and that these differences have persisted over time. In terms of what those species are, so we recorded more of the sorts of species that were associated with dense shrubby understory layers in our revegetation landscapes. So I've got some examples here: yellow thornbill, superb fairy wren. In contrast, in our remnant landscapes, the species that we recorded more often were those associated with mature vegetation, so species that forage on bark or well-developed canopy layers or nest in tree hollows. So really this is showing that revegetation is providing complementary habitat to that provided by native vegetation, and it's not replicating native vegetation entirely at this stage. So some key sort of take-home messages from our landscape level analyses before I move on to the local level findings. Firstly, we found that revegetation does serve to reverse species declines associated with vegetation clearing. So this is a really exciting result, but our findings show that this process does take time, which means that there is a level of forward planning required when thinking about revegetating at larger scales. But working at larger scales allows a bit of strategic planning in terms of where plantings are located in landscapes, particularly when it comes to increasing the connectivity of habitat, such as planting along creek lines and that sort of thing. Secondly, our results show that all plantings contribute to this measure of overall vegetation cover in the landscape, which we saw had a positive effect on birds. Now in this study, most of the plantings that we sampled were pretty small, and often they were undertaken for objectives other than conservation. But nonetheless, they did contribute in a positive way to conservation. So this shows that individual actions can have benefits at broader scales, which is really important, but also that coordinated efforts between individual landholders and larger collections or conservation initiatives will be important too, particularly when revegetating at the larger scales. So at the high end of our revegetation cover gradient, we had 20% cover in the landscape. So that's more likely to be achieved by a coordinated effort. Thirdly, revegetation plantings, remember, provided important resources in their own right, because they're a suite of species that were particularly associated with revegetation habitats. But the flip side of this is that native vegetation is critical and must be retained and protected, because revegetation is not providing for all species in the landscape. Okay, so now let's shift focus to a local perspective, and here we're using our data from the 1 hectare study site. So I'm ignoring our landscape sort of grouping altogether now and focusing on the local value of plantings, and in particular what attributes of plantings increase their value for birds. Here a particular focus was comparing the influence of local management decisions about things like why, where, what and when to plant revegetation. Now we know these decisions can affect the habitat features of individual plantings, and past work has shown that these attributes can have an important effect on birds. A large body of other research also tells us that features of the landscape around habitat patches can be important too. So things like the cover of vegetation, the diversity of land use types. And here we were particularly interested in comparing the relative influence of these broader scale drivers, which can't be influenced by management, as compared to local decisions which are under management control. So what we found is that there were 4 management decisions that did have a particularly strong influence on woodland birds in plantings. Firstly, the decision of what to plant. So here you can see that we recorded more woodland bird species in plantings that contained a greater number of shrub and tree species. Basically, more diverse habitats can provide more complex habitat structure and a diversity of resources for birds. Plantings that were located closer to other existing native vegetation also contained more species. And this gets at the capacity for birds to utilise the availability of other resources as well as those provided by the particular planting itself. Planting management was also found to be important. So plantings that were grazed by stock had fewer woodland bird species, because the grazing is associated with the increased disturbance in the litter and ground layer, which is important for many species in terms of foraging. And lastly, we found a strong positive relationship between the number of woodland bird species in plantings and the age of plantings. And this suggests that plantings improve in value over time, and we found that there was most rapid improvement in the first 10 to 20 years post-planting. So, for management decisions are particularly important. When it came to these broader level influences, we found that there was one variable that was particularly important, and that was the surrounding cover of native vegetation around plantings. We found this to have a positive effect on birds in plantings at 2 scales, in the surrounding 1 kilometre around plantings and 5 kilometres. So native vegetation at broader scale is also really important, but it doesn't serve to override the influence of those other variables that I've talked about. So all are important in their own right. Okay, a couple of key messages from these local level analyses. Firstly, we found that revegetation improves in value over time for birds. There's particularly rapid change in the first 2 decades, showing a quick return on effort and investment. But in results I haven't presented today, we've found that there is ongoing changes after that too. So even by 50 years since planting, revegetation doesn't provide some key habitat features that we know are important, like tree hollows. Secondly, our analyses have shown that by decisions about where and what to plant, local management can have a measurable impact on the conservation value of birds, which is a really important thing to know. Your decisions will make a positive difference. But this importance of vegetation in the surrounding cover also highlights again the importance of coordinated efforts towards revegetation, because by working together there's greater potential to see sort of change in terms of vegetation cover at these larger spatial scales. Okay, so an overall summary about what our projects have shown in terms of the value of revegetation for native birds. At the local level, revegetation is really important for providing habitat resources. So 90% of our woodland birds use plantings at one point in time or other, and collectively these plantings contribute to the overall cover of vegetation in the landscape. And at this broader scale, we found that revegetation can reverse the loss of species associated with vegetation clearing in farm landscapes. Together, these really highlight that vegetation is an effective conservation investment. It's a one-off cost that can be added to build value incrementally over time. It has rapid improvement for conservation value, but its benefit will extend over decades to come. Something that's achievable for individuals, and individual decisions and management can make a really strong impact on the value of plantings. But through collective actions, there is capacity to really transform landscapes. Despite all these benefits, it's really important to finish with a comment about the importance of native vegetation in agricultural landscapes. Whether it's individual mature trees or patches of vegetation, these are really important to protect and retain, because our findings have shown that revegetation really doesn't provide the resources that remnant vegetation does, and it's not easy to replicate or quick to replicate either.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Angie. That was so interesting, and I think a lot of people online would be happy to hear your results that revegetation is so beneficial for birds. There's a lot of re-veg that goes on, and yeah, having that long-term data to back that up is really, really important.
Thanks, Eddie.
No worries. We do have a few questions coming through for you. Let me just pull them up. So a comment there from Costa. So nice to see a project drawing on data that has been gathered since way back in 2005 and 6, and that this is the power of data collection and how its value only increases over time. And a fascinating study. Thanks for that, Costa.
Thanks, Costa.
First question that came in, before you sort of mentioned weather conditions, but was weather data, e.g. Drought conditions, similar for these survey periods, and would this affect bird populations?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. No, it wasn't. So the first survey period was undertaken in the millennium drought, so it was a period of drought conditions, whereas that was not quite so much the case for the second survey period. And we did notice differences in species assemblages. So, for example, we had some species come down into our study region that were present in the region because of more severe drought conditions in other parts of their range, so north central Victoria. So we had some unusual species that we sampled in 2007. And in 2019, again, we saw a whole suite of water birds that had moved down from New South Wales for drought conditions there. So that's a really good point. There's only so much we can account for that sort of factor in terms of the data that we've collected. It's possible it is affecting results, but it's really hard to untangle that from the range of other things that are going on. I guess just one final point about that is the lack of strong change in our remnant landscapes suggests that there's not a massive drought sort of signature on the bird data that we collected, because we didn't see big changes in our sort of the remnant landscapes that we might expect to show that sort of change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it definitely makes sense. I mean, even noticing anecdotally, yeah, like you say, with the birds that came down in 2019, it was quite interesting what we got in the Wimmera that we wouldn't normally get here. So yeah, how that influences your results would be interesting too.
Yeah.
Do you think the growth revegetation areas perhaps mimic remnant vegetation that is recovering from a fire in terms of different bird assemblage?
I'm not too sure exactly whether the question is getting at the progression of change over time, sort of post, like the successional process of change or fire specifically in this region, which I can't talk so much about. But definitely we've done some work looking at using our space for time. So I didn't talk too much about it, but well, there was age results. Our revegetation plantings do span a chronosequence of ages, and we've looked at individual response shapes for different species, and like you might do post-fire, develop predictions about different habitat requirements and whether this can be used to predict change post-planting in birds. And there is some suggestion that that is a useful approach. But I'm not sure if that really gets at the fire side of this question.
Yeah, it's just in the chat, so it's a bit hard to tease out, but that's okay.
Yeah, so hopefully I've answered the question, but I'm not sure I actually have there. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, seeing a landscape recover after fire, maybe is that similar to watching revegetation sort of grow into their age classes and that sort of thing? Is that?
In some ways, I think at the local level, yes, because you can track changes over time similar to what we might see post-fire. But this sort of, at the landscape, you're dealing with spatial pattern questions, which, yes, that's a different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
For fire,
absolutely.
Particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in fire, the species are probably there already, and they will sort of return once the habitat's suitable. But it's in revegetation, they might have to move into a space as well.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the general niche differences of the remnant veg bird group and the established veg bird group? What are the main differences that I think you sort of talked about the hallow versus the shrub. Were there any other differences that you found?
That was mainly the broad differences. So really many more shrub-associated species that need shrubs for shelter, foraging, so superb fairy wren, white-browed scrub wren, New Holland honeyeater were all really, and there's more too, but species associated with those sorts of habitats were much more common in our revegetation landscapes, whereas those in the remnant landscapes require really mature vegetation. Bark for foraging, the tree creepers and satellas, and big canopies for nesting or foraging. And we did see over time, so between 2007 and 2019, that some of the species that increased most in our revegetation were those that were really not recorded in the first survey period, like tree creepers, but were recorded in the second. So some suggestion that there's development of those resources, but certainly a long way to go yet.
Yeah, that's great. It sort of leads into the next question, that is, do you think local replanting decisions could be manipulated to make re-veg sites more supportive upfront for those bird species that you don't find as often? Or is the issue more about the age of plantings and not providing the right sort of environment hollows, and do we just need to wait it out?
A bit of both, but there's certainly some things that you can do, and that would be planting around existing trees, so mature trees that are in the landscape already. If you can plant your planting around that, we've got data that suggests that that will sort of fast track the occurrence of some of these species that require mature vegetation. So that's one way. The other way is to plant close to existing vegetation, because you're more likely to see quicker colonisation of species into the planting because they've got those other resources around them. But yeah, it will be a matter of waiting out this process. Yeah.
Can nest boxes and things be used to replace, or to sort of assist in that transition, or they just don't provide the same value as actual hollows?
Sort of depends which taxa you're talking about.
Yep.
So nest boxes more likely to be used by mammal species than birds, although birds can as well. But another thing that you could do in terms also of supplementing habitat is moving logs from pasture areas, fallen trees, into the revegetation planting. So nest boxes, but also sort of shifting some of these ground low resources that take ages as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you often see the logs sort of piled up in farms, and it's a great spot to put them in re-veg.
Yeah.
Another couple of questions, if we've got a little bit more time. So Louise is wondering if you've presented your findings to communities, farmers, or environmental groups, and have you found that your results have led to greater interest in re-veg projects?
Yes, we have communicated results. That's the first question. So there's been a number of fact sheets, which I should put the link to in the chat. Number of fact sheets on the ARI website that DELP's produced, and there was a brochure from the first project that's also available. The region that we did this study in has quite a long history of revegetation, so I think it's fair to say that there's already an interest in revegetation in this region, and definitely the people, the landholders that we worked with, which weren't very many, like it was over 100 families that we worked with, were interested by and large in the value of their revegetation, and had kept track of the past results when we went back this time, and it was really encouraging to see, and not surprising. I don't mean to sound surprised, but the interest people had. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen your presentation before, and I thought it was fantastic. So I'm glad that we can bring it to even more people who perhaps haven't seen it yet, and we can find the links to those fact sheets as well. We have quite a few more questions. Are you happy to keep answering?
Yeah, or I can hang around after if people want to do that, because I don't want to cut into
Maybe I'll go for one more, and then if you get a chance to answer some of the questions in the chat, that'd be great. This one's come from a YouTube viewer who said, did the study assess pest, plant and animal control and management at the sites as well?
No, is the short answer there. I know that can affect the value of revegetation from other work that's been done in Australia, but we didn't look at that, no.
Yeah. Oh, very good. There are, quite a few more coming in. Thank you so much for your time and for your presentation. And if you want to keep answering questions, that'd be fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Annie.
Thanks, everyone, for all the questions. It's great that there is so much interest. I think it's a fantastic topic. We'll move along to our next presenter, who is Dr. Aaliyah Pearl, and she is the project coordinator of the Victorian Volcanic Plains Biosphere. Aaliyah hails from the USA and grew up in the desert surrounded by a menagerie of animals. She has been passionate about environmental sustainability and conservation ever since. She moved to Melbourne in 2012 to pursue a PhD studying the capacity of reptiles to cope with changing climates. Aaliyah then moved into sustainable agricultural research, and over the last 12 years has worked in conservation, agriculture, biosecurity, and at the interface of all three. She spent considerable time on farms across southeastern Australia studying insect ecology to build better pest management plans. and recently she has turned her focus to the threatened habitats of the Victorian volcanic plain, hoping to find ways for these habitats to coexist with and even benefit from agriculture. Leah lives with her partner James, their 2 dogs, on the northern edge of the VVP at their property in Rimney, Victoria, in Jabberong country. Today, Aaliyah will be presenting on the Victorian Volcanic Plain Biosphere project, which aims to have the VVP recognised as a biosphere under the UNESCO Man and Biosphere program. A successful biosphere listing would help to ensure the necessary communication, coordination and cooperation to achieve a common vision for the VVP, shared by landowners, conservationists, governments and the wide public. Aaliyah is also our logo designer for this year, and we think she's done an amazing job capturing our theme of biodiversity on farms. So thanks, Aaliyah, and I'll pass over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Annie, for the introduction. I'll just share my screen.
Yep, that's working. Perfect.
Yep, great. Let me come back to where I am. All right. Thanks. As Annie said, I'm calling to you guys from just outside the Grampians, right around here from Jabberong country, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. And today I'm here to talk to you about a biosphere. But I want to start by talking about grass. And so let's start by imagining a grassland. And that should be easy because we all know what grasslands look like. They're flat, there's not a lot of trees, and they are grassy. And you might picture something like the African Serengeti with its herds of zebra and umbrella trees. Or closer to my home, maybe you imagine bison standing shoulder deep in wildflowers in the American prairies. But we've got our own temperate grassland much closer to home that we could imagine. And that's right here on the Victorian Volcanic Plain. But you might notice I don't have a nice sweeping photo to show you. Instead, what I have is a little bit of Photoshop trickery. And this right here is unfortunately not the image most of us conjure up when we think about what Victoria looks like. It's not a picture you can go easily take on your camera, but Victoria did indeed once look like this, with vast grasslands and open woodlands and seasonal wetlands and lakes that extended all the way from west of Melbourne to the South Australian border. And these habitats were home to abundant plant and animal species and such a huge diversity of wildflowers that Major Thomas Mitchell called the region the Flowery Plains. We know these grasslands were a staple resource for Aboriginal peoples for at least 30,000 years in the area, with evidence of active managing of the grasslands for food species like Mirnong, to facilitate hunting of marsupials through fire management, and creating the world's oldest aquaculture system for trapping eels at Budge Bim. And so in that way, these habitats evolved in relative harmony under the influence of marsupial grazers, fires, and light human cultivation. When European settlers arrived in the early 1800s, they saw, as John Bateman wrote, the most beautiful sheep pasturage I ever saw in my life. And grazing expanded rapidly onto the Aboriginal lands and really benefited from the seemingly ever-giving grasslands. Of course, that wasn't really the case, and it wasn't too long before grazers did see a productivity decline from those grasslands as the most palatable species got grazed out, leaving behind the tougher but not considered very delicious species like speargrass. And this actually brings us to the point at which the painting, which I've been using to collage these images, was created by Eugene von Gerard as he looked out from Beaufort in 1866 onto the sheep pastures. Now, to combat that declining productivity, this is when grazers began to sow over large areas with more cattle and sheep tolerant pasture grasses like ryegrass and clovers that we are familiar with from back home in Europe. And then this picture really changed in the late 1800s with the creation of really powerful fertilizers like superphosphate, because when those are applied to the pastures, those introduced European species really flourish, but the native grassland species never actually evolved a mechanism to take advantage of all that extra nutrient in the ground, and they find themselves dramatically outcompeted. And that brings us to the image that is the much more familiar thing we conjure up when we think about what the volcanic plains looks like today. And it's the really short and simplified story of how we went from 2.3 million hectares of that native habitat down to less than 1% remaining in only 3 generations. Now, of course, we can't bring it all back. And that's not our goal anyways. We know we live in human-dominated systems now, but the worry is that we might still be on this trajectory. And if we don't shift the balance to make it easier for those remnant bits of habitat to live, but also to thrive in our new human-dominated landscapes, we might lose that little bit we do have left. And it's not going to be an easy thing to shift that balance. There's some big challenges that would need to be overcome. For instance, the fact that native grasslands can be hard to spot. Before you really know what you're looking at, they might just look like any old weedy grassy paddock. There's also the sort of PR problem that they've had for a while, which is that they're not quite as flashy as the diversity in a rainforest or a reef. And they demand you stop and give them a bit more time to really get down on the ground and get treated to the beauty that's hidden within. And we know that they can be a bit tricky to manage alongside human activities due to their need for a regular fire regime, their sensitivity to grazing, their dependence on having good marsupial mammal activity. And all that means we need to really think creatively about how these habitats are going to coexist with the future of farming that will, of course, be a very important part of Victoria into the future. At this point, though, I just want to stop and hop up onto my soapbox a little, so forgive me. But we really need to ask, why do we actually care? Why do we want to try and shift the balance a bit more to these native habitats? And in the time I've been in Australia, as Annie mentioned in my intro, I've been lucky enough to work in quite a lot of fields, studying ecology and conservation, working in agriculture, working in biosecurity, and I guess being quite surprised by the places where the three have actually overlapped. And I think the most important thing I've learned is that there can be a huge diversity in motivations all behind the same vision. And there is absolutely no wrong reason to want to see environments protected, whether it comes from the fact that you love the beauty of wildflowers or bird songs, or you want your kids to grow up with memories of playing in nature like you got to grow up with, or you feel a religious responsibility, or you love an appreciation for history, or a desire for reconciliation with Indigenous people who have already lost way too much of their culture, or perhaps it comes from economic interests. Because healthy environments, they draw in tourists to come see that beauty, which invigorates local economies. If businesses adopt sustainable practices, that can help distinguish their products and ensure that their business maintains its social license to continue into the future. And as we already heard a little bit about this morning, and we'll, I'm sure, hear lots more throughout the rest of the seminar, there's a whole suite of other on-farm benefits that could be achieved through on-farm biodiversity that actually help the farm's bottom dollar through, for instance, low-input native pastures or healthy soils and water cycling or pollination. And all these interests bring us to the same vision of a VVP-wide community that is united by care and pride for those natural habitats, but also benefit from them and want to see those assets protected into the future. Now that's a big old vision, and you might be rightly asking, well, how do you suggest we go about achieving this? And the group I'm working with thinks that one really promising way might be through the creation of a biosphere. So I'll shift gears a little bit now and tell you what a biosphere is. And if you've never heard of a biosphere through the United Nations program, through their educational, scientific, and cultural organization, UNESCO, you might actually be surprised to learn that there's already 4 of these internationally accredited biospheres that exist in Australia. So I'll give you a sense of where this program kind of sits in the international ecosystem of organizations and governments. And we have the United Nations and their scientific branch, UNESCO. They have other branches like the Food and Agricultural Organization. And we have a lot of international non-governmental organizations like the World Conservation Union, and you might know them from their Threatened Species Red List that they put out. And in the 60s, these groups came together at a series of conferences collaborating and identified the need for a program that wasn't just looking at conservation and environment in a vacuum, but it needed to look at the interaction between humans living and working in those environments they wanted to conserve. And that is how this Man in the Biosphere program was born, which is the program where we create these biospheres. And the same collaborators, and around the same time, we see a few other programs that might be familiar to you created as well, such as the World Heritage Convention, which was the way that Victoria's very own Budge Bim was recently recognized as part of that international community of World Heritage Sites. The hallmark of the Biosphere program, which was really unique and really pretty ambitious, was that a global community of test sites were going to be created. These test sites are places where local solutions could be researched to local problems, which are also global problems of balancing humans and the environment. And these sites were called Biosphere Reserves. And you can see on this map, we've got quite a lot of them now. But please don't be put off by the word reserve. These are not reserves in the sense that Australians are generally familiar with the term, like a conservation reserve where human activities are very restricted. And in fact, in these 714 biosphere reserves across the globe right now, there's 250 million people living inside their boundaries. And that means the primary function of a biosphere cannot stop at just conservation. And in fact, it has three required functions to be able to achieve this biosphere predation and maintain it. And that is the first being conservation of landscape species. But the second is promoting sustainable human development. And the third being that the biosphere has to provide scientific and technical support to both those ends. And if the biosphere can't show that they're supporting both environment and sustainable human development, then they can't maintain their credential. That's why this model is really quite unique, because it's not a vehicle just for human exclusion style conservation. It recognizes more that across a larger landscape, you're going to have sort of a patchwork of where priorities might need to be shifted between humans and the environment, which I've tried to sort of show in this picture, where there's going to be areas where there's a lot, heavier human influence, for instance, and areas with higher quality habitat. And the way the biosphere tries to balance this is by creating different zones where the prioritization shifts. And at the zone, which is called the core zone, where prioritization is shifted most fully towards conservation, you can see here. And that's areas where you might find a national park or a conservation reserve. And the focus here is really about research. But then as you move outside of those cores, we establish a buffer zone, and they're meant on one hand to protect the core, but also to start opening up more human activities around those cores, and particularly encourage those activities that increase education and awareness and excitement and love for the natural assets in the cores. And we can have things like ecotourism, a lot of school activities, and communities living and working. And then as we step back even further, the rest of the biosphere is part of the transition zone. And that's where the focus is very much on the communities, where we have most of our human developments, where they're united in pride and love for their natural areas, but they're also benefiting and profiting from those areas through ecotourism and green product loyalty. And there's a lot of focus on education and awareness to improve our conservation outcomes. So I hope that gives you a good high-level picture of what the point of a biosphere reserve is. I haven't really answered the question of what does a biosphere look like, so I'll tackle that now. And one important point is that UNESCO doesn't build this for you and doesn't tell you exactly how you build it. They're purpose-built by their participants. They can vary a fair bit in structure and funding depending on where they are. So for that reason, I think the best way to learn about how it could work in Victoria is to look at the biospheres already established in Australia. We actually have one here in Victoria with us, the Western Port Biosphere. These 4 biospheres have all been in existence for over 10 years now. We have more on the way. Sunshine Coast Council has just put in their application. But I'm going to just focus a little bit now on Noosa Biosphere to give some examples of what these look like on the ground and how it could benefit our area. So Noosa Biosphere, established in 2007. It comprises the entirety of Noosa Shire, along with some 3 miles of its marine areas beyond the coast. And there's 3 main ways that the biosphere has been able to support the environment and the community of Noosa. And that is by enhancing coordination and collaboration with all its different people and interest groups, by attracting research, but particularly focused on quite holistic research, and by bringing recognition to the Shire and their work. So we'll start with coordination. We've got this thing, the biosphere. We know that it's linked up to this international program and community. But we need somebody on the local level who's essentially championing the biosphere, running it, providing its operational costs and management. And in Noosa, that is the Noosa Council who champions it. The actual biosphere is 2 parts. There's a reserve foundation, which is there's a volunteer skills-based board of directors that manages their public trust. And then there's the community association. And this is where anyone who wants to have a say can get involved. And they've got over 300 volunteer members. And those members and funding partners are from a really diverse range of interests. It's not just environmental groups. We have social groups, educational groups, traditional owner groups, universities, tourism groups, industries, and so forth. And Noosa has found this really flat structure that they've been trying to build has been really valuable for giving equal, excuse me, that was a bit of a mouse flick, giving all of its members equal access to give their input, particularly those groups that are more traditionally disenfranchised, such as traditional owner groups and young people. And Noosa, for example, since establishing their biosphere, has seen successful native title legislations by their traditional owners, the Kabi Kabi people, across the whole Shire now. And they've also seen the establishment of their very first Youth Action Committee, which is a direct link for young people to the council. Because of that coordination and collaboration, that strength in numbers, the Biosphere has been able to attract research and create some really ambitious research projects that are involving a lot of partners for a more holistic look. And I'll give you a little quick example of a really cool project that I think just really exemplifies what a biosphere is all about, and that's their Bring Back the Fish project, which in response to research that was showing the oysters of Noosa River had become functionally extinct, which is not just an environmental issue, it's a tourism issue, and it's a cultural issue. Oysters were a staple for the Kabi Kabi people for thousands of years. So a lot of people want to see the oysters not be lost. And so a really diverse group of partners, these are just some of the big sources of funding on this project, came together and undertook a really holistic project that involved a catchment-wide survey of erosion damage hotspots and remediation, and also involved the creation of new artificial oyster reefs, thanks to oysters donated from the fishery industry and research coordinated through universities, and input coming from tourism and council and parks groups on what sort of human use patterns these reefs would need to be built around. And to make a long story short, the pilot went really well. It was really exciting. There was still a lot to work on to improve, but the Nature Conservancy looked at the results, was really excited, and decided to step in with a $1.2 million investment to take that pilot and scale it up into a full and permanent reef system, which is exactly, the sort of outcome that Noosa was hoping for. And that program, particularly the part that was focused on the erosion remediation, was just last month recognized by the United Nations themselves through one of their highest scientific awards for the management of a biosphere. And I think this is a great illustration of the collaboration leading to better research outcomes and therefore more improvements to natural assets, bringing in recognition. And that recognition then brings in better resources, more funding, new partners, improving the research, and it creates a positive feedback. And Noosa has certainly benefited a lot from the recognition. They've won numerous awards since establishing their biosphere. They've seen record numbers of tourist visitors, and they have been actively capitalizing on that to make sure all the tourists don't just go to the beach to go fishing and see the reefs. And I think this is an area, again, which could be really exciting as we think about in Victoria. Another thing they've launched is a master plan to link up all their more hinterland areas, encourage people to explore wider than just the really obvious spots to visit, go biking, go horseback riding, and visit little towns and invigorate those economies as well. So I don't think it's hard to see how the VVP could benefit from this enhanced coordination, this ambitious research, and this increased recognition. And the foundation is absolutely already laid. We're not really that far away from this sort of system. And I just want to acknowledge the huge number of organizations that are already working, despite the sort of fragmented state of our VVP habitats. Inside all those fragments, there's some really exciting stories of success, of habitats being restored, grasslands replanted, wetland functioning restored, and even farms experimenting with bringing these native habitats into their farms to see how they can coexist and even improve profits. And this is absolutely not a list of everybody. And in those patches, there's really great research as well. I've been learning a bit about the plantings that have happened down in Warrnambool, not too far south of me. And we get in those patches research about how you go about replanting a grassland. And there's nothing stopping us from scaling that up in the same way that Noosa is now scaling up their artificial reef research to the whole region. And similarly, the research that's happening on local farms about how to bring in these native habitats, when we can package up those results and share them widespread, we could be looking at our own bring back the farm biodiversity type holistic projects. And that brings us recognition. We've already seen the importance of recognition. Budge Bim certainly was all over the media after their World Heritage listing. And similarly, getting inspired by that coordinated tourist framework that Noosa is pursuing. What if we had our own Great Volcano Drive, where we're getting tourists from all over the country or even the world coming to drive along highways that have been replanted with wildflowers, going birding in wetlands teeming with life, and really importantly, putting all that back into the local towns that they're visiting. Now, one important point I want to make is about what the biosphere doesn't do, and that is it doesn't supersede the existing laws, and that means it doesn't interfere with current businesses or lifestyles. They can continue as is, but the biosphere aims to create better opportunities for those businesses and lifestyles to adopt more sustainable practices and benefit from them. Now, if you liked this vision, which I sincerely hope that, sounds pretty exciting, it may sound a bit, oh my goodness, how do we actually achieve that? And so that's the next big question is, what do we even need to do to get started? And I won't tiptoe around the fact that it's not going to be an easy process and not necessarily a quick one either. But the main first step is to find our own champion on the volcanic plain, the organization that sees this vision and thinks, well, this is really in line with my vision for my local area anyways, and is willing to commit to that sort of operational support that keeps the biosphere running. And then we need to build our team of all the different groups who want to contribute to the strategic vision. And once we know who's keen and who's really passionate about this, we can start looking at building our map of how this biosphere might look, how far a region can we go, how ambitious can we be. The group that I'm working for, the Victorian Volcanic Plain Biosphere Incorporated, we're a registered charity organization that's looking to facilitate that process. So we've been researching the biosphere program, talking to the other biospheres in Australia, and we'll be approaching local governments and stakeholder groups to try and build that proposed map. So then I hope you're asking, what can you do? Really, first easy one is please come join our group where we'll keep you up to date on progress and events. You can also call your council because we really need a lot of support from the people who actually want this to happen at pressuring their local governments to want to get involved. And you can just keep an eye on this space because as we go forward, we're definitely going to need a lot of help through support letters, participation in community consultations, all the work it takes to actually build this sort of thing. Now, I have to stop and acknowledge this point that I'm speaking at the Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar and not the Volcanic Plain Biodiversity Seminar. So for those of you who are not in the volcanic plains, your question might be, well, what then? And I just want to say, then there's nothing stopping you from still pursuing this program and looking into starting your own biosphere for your area. Because the whole point of these is they're not in a silo. They are part of an international community, and in Australia, a national community. They're learning from each other, from their successes, and the more there are, the more power and knowledge we have. So with that, I'll just end here with some links if you are keen to join us and help make this vision a reality. Thank you so much for your time.
That's great. Thank you so much, Aaliyah. It's very inspiring, like seeing how these things can work together and hopefully will work together for the VVP. And you say that the Wimmera is slightly outside the VVP, but we have some lovely Wimmera grasslands up here as well, which I don't know if they'd potentially qualify for the biosphere, but it's a bit of a passion project that we want to try and coordinate some efforts and get, I guess, some work done and get people passionate about it. The grasslands are great.
Yeah, and I think that just comes back to the idea that, like, there's going to be so many mutual learnings. What's happening in New South Wales grasslands. I've been learning a bit more about the research over there, and there's still a huge amount relevant to the volcanic plains and to the Wimmera. I've been asked to put the last slide back on, so I'll do that.
Yeah, there's a few people wanting the links.
Oh, I'm still sharing, aren't I? Whoops.
You are, so you can just go back.
Apologies.
No, you're fine.
There we go.
Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions. I guess I wanted to maybe kick off. Who are you hoping will sort of champion the BVP biosphere? Do you have some candidates in mind, or where are you guys up to with working that out?
I'm not going to dob in anyone in particular, but I will say what I've learned from speaking to the other biospheres. It's been really great, particularly Noosa and Western Port here in Victoria. I've been able to have some very helpful conversations, and thanks to their candor really about what works and what doesn't. I think the big learning is the importance of having local councils very heavily involved, if not championing it themselves. Because to be effective, the biosphere really needs to have some say in those kind of local planning strategies. And I think I've also learned that the council has found a lot of value in being a part of the biosphere because it becomes their way of delivering their projects. So our sort of next step is definitely, now that we understand a bit more about what the program looks like and how it could be implemented, we'll be chatting with more of the local government groups and see.
I guess you will have a few across the VVP.
Yeah, that is also another reason why this is going to be an ambitious thing. There's a lot of jurisdictions we could cross. We don't know how big we can actually go without, shooting a bit too far. So we're very much in an exploratory phase right now. Yeah.
Oh, good luck with it, because obviously councils sounds like they're best placed to lead it or champion it. Yeah. We've got a few more questions. Let me just find some for you. So there's one about, do you have support from Pyrenees Shire? But I guess that'll be in development.
Yeah, we're still relatively early stages. Really, the last 2 months I've spent researching the Biosphere program to make sure we're ready to start seeking out partnerships at this point.
Yeah, cool. Are there any resources for farms wanting to regenerate grasslands on their properties?
I think there will be some people much, much better placed than me to speak on that. And the folks who make those resources are the folks we're hoping to get involved in our Biosphere project. But I know I've seen a lot of nice resources from Corangamite CMA, Glenelg Hopkins CMA, for instance. I'll maybe leave that to the experts to share some links.
Yeah, we also had the Jaluka Land Care Group give a presentation last year about how they have recreated grassland just out of Halls Gap. So we can share the link to that presentation as well. There's another question about what is Vic Road's involvement? Will they be part of your discussions in the next steps? Yeah,
I think it would be really wonderful to have involvement from Vic Road, since this was, I think, one of my biggest surprises when I started learning about these native grasslands is how many are within Vic Road's land, because those are the sorts of areas that have been a little bit more regularly burned and protected from grazing, and it's just not really the spot you think you're going to find the highest quality habitat, but sure enough there it is.
And they're big areas too, hey, when you've got a tiny little road but a massive roadside. Yeah.
And that could really, I think, work in favor, especially around this tourism angle. Like, people are driving along roadsides, and if those roadsides are where we're really focusing on our efforts to bring these habitats to front and center limelight, that's a pretty huge win-win, I would think.
Yeah, totally agree.
I'm going to be photoshopping some of these comments of folks mentioning programs they've heard of.
Yeah, absolutely. How can private landowners access expertise and practitioners to undertake Indigenous burning? This might be a bit left field for you.
Yeah, I wouldn't presume to be in a position to speak about Indigenous burning practices, because that's very much not within my expertise.
I can, I guess, answer that a little bit.
From
a government point of view, the CFA are probably, a good starting point for private landholders to access any burning on private property, and they can probably put you in touch with Indigenous groups, because there is some cultural burning happening in the Wimmera, and I'm sure elsewhere. But yeah, you can get in touch with your local authorities are probably the best point of call there. What else have we got? We've got a few comments that Corangamite CMA currently have a grassy eucalypt woodland project running. The Pyrenees Shire has a roadside preservation program, which might be helpful. Some lovely comments about for you, Aaliyah, and for Angie about the presentations. Question from Wendy: do you have any resources or further information for replanting grasslands? So we could probably share some things that, as we said, some other presentations and things until you guys get up and running. I guess I had a question about the group that I guess employs you. Are they funded sort of as a non-government organisation, or how have they come into being in the first place?
We're a registered charity organization. We'd sort of been working on getting our tax-deductible recipient status for a little while, so it was pretty exciting to get that squared away last year. And we've got a sort of smallish volunteer committee. We've been meeting monthly lately, and yeah, I guess my role came about because we were able to wrangle up a bit of private business loan just to get us started. And yeah, it's really been helpful for helping us get some motivation, because this idea has been around for a while, but it's really about finding the time and a little bit of funding support to actually make it happen. And that's also why we're going to be relying pretty heavily on folks who really like this vision and might be able to get involved with volunteer support and donations.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think it sounds like it will be quite helpful even to have a group that potentially is facilitating and coordinating some of the work that is already happening on the VVP, and perhaps beyond. I think that is almost about it for questions. Thank you everyone for sending all those things in. There are lots of links in the chat, links to more information, Facebook groups, another group there from Pauline, that everyone can sort of find some more information about grasslands. But I do also encourage you to have a look at our seminar from last year that was presented by Angie Haslam from Jaluka Landcare, because they've done a great job down there as well. Thanks, Aaliyah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Alrighty, I guess that just about concludes today's seminar, and we're running sort of just right on time. So thank you everyone for attending our very first one. Hopefully there haven't been too many tech issues. I saw a few things come in on the chat, but hopefully you've all been able to enjoy it. Just wanted to let everyone know that next week we'll be doing the same thing in the same place with two new speakers. So we'll have Dr. Jim Radford from La Trobe University talking about farm scale natural capital accounting, what it is and why it's good for farmers, and Danny Penagle from who is a local landcare facilitator for the Loddon Plains Landcare Network. He's talking about designing resilient and adaptive community-based landscape restoration projects. So you'll be sent a Teams link and a YouTube link, so the day before, next Wednesday before the seminar, so feel free to use whatever format works best for you. I think that's almost it. Until then, thank you to everyone who has joined in today and for all the participation. It's absolutely been fantastic, and I hope you've really enjoyed the presentations. If you are looking for more information, we can post some more links to things, Facebook groups, that sort of thing, on our social media. So we've got Instagram, Facebook, and the recording for this presentation will be available on the Swift website as well, potentially by next week, but we'll see how we go. But it will be available for anyone who wants to catch up, or if you do want to share it. Thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you all next week.